Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallama ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. In this lesson, we'll begin our study of the textbook of this course. The textbook of this course is the Isagoge of Athiruddin al-Abhari, and in this lesson, we'll read his introduction. The book by Abhari is called Isagoge. Isagoge was a term that was first applied as a name to a book written by the Hellenistic philosopher Porphyry, who wrote his own Isagoge as an introduction to Aristotle's book called The Categories. Porphyry's Isagoge was translated into Latin by Boethius, and through that route we saw in the second part of the first lesson, we saw that it made its way into medieval Europe, and it was translated into Arabic in the 8th century by a scholar known as Ibn al-Muqaffa. And from this translation, it made its way into the Arabic-speaking Muslim world. This translation was refined, commented on, summarized, and eventually it made its way to the book that we have before us today, which is the Isagoge of Athiruddin al-Abhari. Now, what we want to note as we read this introduction, that even though Abhari's Isagoge has the same name as Porphyry's Isagoge, and even though the goal of Abhari's Isagoge is the same as the goal of Porphyry's Isagoge, namely to be an introduction to the science of logic, the two books are in fact very different. And the key difference that we want to focus on is that as Abhari's Isagoge is the result of a long development of Aristotelian logic within the Muslim scholarly tradition. Although the origin of Abhari's Isagoge is Aristotelian, it actually became something very different. And that's something that we want to focus on as we read his introduction. So he begins his introduction with the Basmala, the formula that all Muslim scholars begin their religious works with, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. He then goes on to praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, I praise Allah Most High for His God-given success, ask Him for guidance to His path, and send blessings on our Master Muhammad and his family, one and all. What we want to note here immediately is that Abhari was a devout Muslim. Although he is writing an introduction to logic, he is beginning, as Muslim religious scholars do when they write their books on sacred law, on Quranic exegesis, on hadith, on any of the religious sciences, he begins with the mention of God's name, and by praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and by sending blessings upon the last and final prophet, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Abhari goes on and to introduce his book, and he says that this is a treatise on logic, هذه رسالة في المنطق, in which I have mentioned what someone who begins studying any one of the sciences must keep in mind. Any one of the sciences. So what Abhari is saying is that this book is an introduction to logic, and anyone who studies any science needs to know logic. The sciences in the Muslim scholarly tradition were traditionally divided into two categories. The first category was the philosophical sciences, and we introduced the philosophical sciences in the first lesson of this course. We saw that there were 6 and subdivided into two categories, the theoretical and the practical Aristotelian sciences. So the philosophical sciences refers to the Aristotelian sciences. The second category of sciences were the revelatory sciences, which we've also seen in more than one lesson before this lesson. And these were sciences such as Quranic exegesis, fiqh, hadith, and so on, the religious sciences. The commentators and the authors of the glosses on Abhari's Isagoge, some of them, they mention that what Abhari means by any one of the sciences is he means the philosophical sciences, because the philosophical sciences, they are firmly grounded in Aristotelian logic. One needs to know the terms of Aristotelian logic in order to do anything in the philosophical sciences, and that in fact, was why Porphyry wrote his Isagoge, because before someone could study the works of Aristotle, they needed to have a basic introduction to the basic terms of logic. But other scholars, they have argued that that when he sees, and when Abhari says any one of the sciences, he actually really meant any of the sciences, even the revelatory sciences. One of the revelatory sciences in particular, namely kalam, which we saw in an earlier lesson, swallowed philosophy, and so logic is just as important for a proper study of kalam as it is for the philosophical sciences. And in this course is a prerequisite to a Kalam course, in which we will apply all of the concepts that we learned in this course, and we'll see how they are found in one of the Islamic sciences. But really, it's not just for the science of Kalam that the science of logic is needed. It's needed for all of the religious sciences, and that's why Imam al-Ghazali made his famous statement that the knowledge of anyone who does not know logic is not to be trusted. Whoever من لا معرفة له بعلم المنطق لا ثقة بعلمه. And the reason why we need this science for all of the sciences is because, as we saw in the previous lesson, the questions of all of the sciences are inferential, and logic is the science that teaches you how to do correct inference, and particularly when things get confused and there are fallacious arguments and false and incorrect positions, and one needs to sift through everything, one needs to know logic. A training in logic helps one sift through these things, and this becomes even more important when the terminology that people use is the terminology of the logicians. So if the religious sciences had not been written in the language of the Muslim logicians, then there might be an argument that one does not need to do logic. It's not needed as much. But in fact, what ended up happening was that all of the Islamic sciences ended up being written in the language of logic. Even if you study Quranic exegesis, they will use logical terms. They will use logical methods. And that's why books and introduction to logic such as this one were mandatory parts of all Islamic studies curricula all over the world. And so when Imam al-Abhari, he says that this is a treatise on logic in which I have mentioned what someone who begins studying any one of the sciences must keep in mind, he actually means any one of the sciences, whether they be the philosophical sciences or whether they be the revelatory sciences. And in fact, this book was most frequently studied as an introduction to the revelatory sciences, not as an introduction to the philosophical sciences. Abhari's Isagoge was one of the most popular introductions to the science of logic that was used anywhere in the Muslim world. Imam al-Abhari, he continues, and he says that I have written this treatise while seeking the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for verily He is the benefactor of goodness and bounty. Again, we note that he was a devout Muslim. This is a book that is written by a devout Muslim for a religious purpose. Logic in the Islamic tradition is a science that has religious value. It's a communal obligation to study this science, and one cannot study the religious sciences without studying this science. Abhari's book was used in a religious context. He was a devout Muslim. This is a very important difference between Abhari's Isagoge and Porphyry's Isagoge. Abhari continues and he says Isagoge. This is the title that he gives before he begins his book. Now, the word Isagoge is a Greek word, and the scholars who commented on Abhari's work, they differed regarding the meaning of this word. The most popular explanation of this word, meaning of this word that's given by the commentators, is that it refers to the 5 universals. The 5 universals is something that we'll study very shortly. In a couple of lessons, we'll study the 5 universals. It's a topic it's a chapter in Abhari's book. And so they said that Isagoge means the 5 universals. Others, they said that the word Isagoge means introduction. It's Greek for introduction. And others, they said that Isagoge is the name of a person. and that this book was originally written in a dialogue fashion where a teacher and student are having a dialogue, and the name of the student was Isagoge. Now, in fact, we know that the meaning of Isagoge is introduction, because Isagoge is an anglicization, or in Isagoge, an Arabization of a Greek word, Isagoge, and Isagoge means introduction. So the correct answer to what the word Isagoge means is introduction. However, to say that it means the five universals is also plausible, because Porphyry's Isagoge, which I hope that you'll browse through after this lesson, you'll see that it was restricted to the five universals. Abhari's Isagoge contains more topics than Porphyry's did, and Porphyry's book was a book about the five universals, and so since his book about the five universals was called Isagoge, it would make sense that people who wrote about the topic of the five universals would also call their book Isagoge, and it would make sense for Abhari here to mention Isagoge not as a heading of his book, but as a heading to his discussion of the five universals, which is one of the first topics that he's going to discuss in his book. But again, an important thing that we want to note, which is the key point in this lesson, is that this discussion happens without any knowledge of Greek. The Muslim logicians, when they discuss the meaning of the word Isagoge, nobody says, well, let's go back to the Greek original, let's read Porphyry's Isagoge, let's look at the conjugation of the Greek verb, let's look at these things. And the reason why they don't do that, and the reason why mistakes are perpetuated, so it's a mistake to say that Isagoge means the five universals. It's a mistake to say that it refers to the name of a person. The word Isagoge means introduction. It's Greek for introduction, but this mistake is perpetuated, and it's still found in books that are published today that were written only a generation or two ago. So although it's unfortunate that it's a mistake, it does tell us an interesting point, and that is that the Muslim logicians were not referring to the Greek works. The Muslim logicians were working independently within their own scholarly tradition, and Abhari's Isagoge is a product of the Muslim scholarly tradition. It's different from Porphyry's Isagoge. And after this lesson, I'll have you. One of the assignment after this lesson is to browse through the two Isagoges, Porphyry's and Abhari's, and you'll see that they differ in topic. So Porphyry's Isagoge is actually generally mostly about just the five universals, whereas Abhari's Isagoge can be divided into three sections. He has an introductory section on language, he has a second section on conceptual knowledge, and he has a third section on propositional knowledge. The section on conceptual knowledge is divided into two subcategories. He talks about the five universals. The five universals are needed in order for us to know how to form a definition, and a definition is how we arrive at conceptual knowledge. More on all of these topics in future lessons that are dedicated to these topics. And the section on propositional knowledge is divided into a section on propositions, which we need in order to make arguments. And again, we'll talk about this in a future lesson in greater detail. The thing to note is that the topics are different. The topics are more mature. If you read Porphyry's Isagoge, you'll find the language is very refined, brief, concise, precise. It reflects centuries of refinement and precision. Porphyry's this is Abhari's Isagoge. Porphyry's Isagoge is different. Porphyry's Isagoge is a book that's written for the first time. It's verbose. There's repetition. There's imprecision, and that's why in the Latin tradition, Porphyry's Isagoge is famous for sparking a number of philosophical debates that were never solved. That's not why Abhari's Isagoge is famous in the Islamic tradition. So keep all of those thoughts in your mind as you browse through the two Isagoges quickly after this lesson and note some of the similarities and differences. We'll end this lesson with a question, which is language. What in the world is language doing in a treatise on logic? I can understand why I need to learn about conceptual and propositional knowledge, because in a book on logic, because logic teaches us how to do inference, and we infer two kinds of knowledge, either conceptual or propositional. But why language? What does language have to do with logic? If this is a textbook in logic, why is Abhari discussing language? What is the relationship between language and logic? Does logic need language? And this is our point of departure for our next lesson, in which we'll ask the question, does logic need language, in order to be a transition into the study of the first proper chapter of the book, which is on language. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والله سبحانه وتعالى أعلم وهو حسبنا ونعم الوكيل.